Very concentrated life that knew exactly where it was going. The Van Gogh Vision on Adrienne Clarkson presents The Knack.
Welcome to the first program in my new series. You've been with me in previous years for Summer Festival, and now the festival's going year-round. What I present is going to be a celebration of every aspect of the creative impulse, an investigation of all the reasons why life becomes transformed by human beings seeing things differently and attempting to capture that vision in paint or film, by hearing sounds and making music, by recreating situations in words to write books. Sometimes you're going to meet the great artists such as soprano Jessie Norman, or the film director David Lean, or Leonard Cohen. And sometimes you'll meet people who are aspiring to be the best, but haven't quite done it yet, people like you and me. All creation requires great struggle, sacrifice, and discipline to result in making something beautiful and emotionally satisfying. This program wants to give you insight into that beauty and the conflict of creation. Before tonight's show on Vincent van Gogh, here's a brief sample of what's coming up in the year ahead.
If you come...
Pavarotti gives his blessing to a Canadian opera house in Paris.
Beautiful. Absolutely gorgeous. Compliment.
The famous playwright breaks his Pinteresque silence. And what about the writing? When did that start? As a child?
It started when I fell in love, I think, when I was about 13. And I wrote despairing poems and prose poems and this, that, and the other, and I've never stopped doing that.
I hope I don't come across as a junkie, and I hope I don't come across as someone who gets beaten by men. I don't share any of those things with Billie Holiday.
God bless that child, bless God his own.
And Shakespeare, as you've never heard him.
What hempen homespun have we here? Weed wide enough to wrap a fairy in.
And coming to center ice, the Dean of Canadian Composers, John Weinslide. And we'll be right back after this. 100 years ago today, Vincent van Gogh wrote to his family from the little French village of Auvers-sur-Oise that he was working so furiously, painting one canvas a day, because he was trying to express the desperately swift passing of things in modern life. No one has stated better what the artist as a human being feels driven to do than Van Gogh. And 6 weeks after he wrote those words, he was dead at 37 of a self-inflicted gunshot wound. You know from all the headlines that a single painting now of Van Gogh sells for $50 or $60 million. And that's an incredible irony for this artist who was so little known and even despised by ordinary, respectable people in his lifetime. But Van Gogh's truth has fully emerged by now, the 100th anniversary of his death, currently being celebrated the world over, but particularly in the Netherlands, his birthplace, by several major exhibitions. I wanted to show you the Van Gogh who painted the sun-drenched landscapes of the south of France and whose vision was changed by the light and the warmth of Provence. As a student, I saw a painting of Van Gogh's in a show at the Art Gallery of Toronto. It was called Flowering Almond Branch Against the Sky. It seemed such a mixture of the Orient and of Europe, and it electrified me and made me decide to go to France to find that landscape. Van Gogh's vision has transformed the perceptions of us all. Let's watch.
it's a great story to begin with. It's a tragic story, but it also has its moments of triumph, intense passion. But also I think it's a story of a very concentrated life that knew exactly where it was going.
Ronald Pickvance is like an English detective from a turn-of-the-century novel. Years of his life have been spent examining the footprints of a man long dead, looking for clues in the landscapes he painted.
I think to see Van Gogh as a kind of meteor and a madman has some element of truth, but it's by no means the whole truth.
In the town cemetery of Auvers, 30 kilometers northwest of Paris, the detective becomes a pilgrim. For as Ronald Pickvance has found, as an art historian, any investigation into the life of Van Gogh is transformed into a journey of the spirit.
It's finding his voice that maybe is one of my searches in looking at him. He was thought as the eccentric, the oddball, the madman, and so on. But it's this fascination of watching the mind and the hand controlling his total development as a person.
He has written books and curated major exhibitions of Van Gogh's work, but still, the mystery remains. Why is it that people become so interested in Van Gogh? What is this almost obsession people have with him? He's probably the best-known popular artist, cutting of the ear and so on. Why are you, Ronald Pickvance, so interested in Van Gogh? Is it as an art historian? There's something more than that, isn't there?
Well, the interest began long before I was an art historian, in that I can remember reading the letters and being captivated by this author. I think he's just a great 19th century novelist who didn't write a novel. And of course this ties in with his work as well, and once one saw the work, the two began to gel, and then my interest simply was relating work to writing, seeing them as part of a whole man, then seeing the man as part of his time, in relationship particularly to French painting, which became one of my passions. So I don't see him as an isolated person, either as an artist or a writer or a Dutchman or a Protestant, but as someone who is part of a movement and yet different from it.
The sunflowers hang today in the office of the president of a Japanese insurance company. Reproductions in their countless thousands sell all over the world. What is this phenomenon called Van Gogh? In his lifetime, we all know, he was mostly ignored, his work unwanted, while today so many of his paintings are as familiar to us as our own childhood. Who was he? Try finding the answer in his self-portraits. In some eyes, he was a modern saint with a compulsion to love and help mankind. And in keeping with a saintly character, he was stubborn and infuriating and ready for martyrdom. Van Gogh declared that he wanted to paint portraits that a century later would seem to be apparitions. They are portraits, nonetheless, of loneliness and isolation, already evident in the 13-year-old boy. More than most adolescents, he agonized about his future life. Was he to become like his father, Theodorus Van Gogh, a minister of the Dutch Reformed Church? With the church, he could have contact with everyday life in a way that was spiritually fulfilling and was a way out of his loneliness. Through family connections, Pastor Van Gogh found a job for his misfit son, not in the church. Young Vincent became an art dealer, first working in the Netherlands, then London, and finally at the firm's main office in Paris. It was a long way from where he grew up, in the region of Brabant in the south of Holland. The landscape held him all his life, and so for many years did the church. His fierce evangelism and volatile moods eventually got him fired from his job in Paris. He was disillusioned anyway with the business. But years later, he was delighted when his younger, devoted brother Theo also became an art dealer. With Theo, he could always be completely open. And in those years in the Paris cafes, the brothers grew closer, and Vincent painted in the style of his Impressionist friends, such as Toulouse-Lautrec, who made this pastel of Van Gogh. The hunched shoulders show an artist with an argument to make. Argument was a part of his life in Paris, with Theo when they lived together in Montmartre, overlooking the city, and with all the other artists they knew, Lautrec, Signac, and Paul Gauguin. Through art and argument, Van Gogh had found a new way to express his spiritual yearnings. People generally don't know that about Van Gogh, that he was a complex, interesting, intellectual person. He spoke several languages, he read Shakespeare. He had so many dimensions to his character.
Yes, this is very true again, that he was multilingual and certainly had a wide expanse of reading in several languages. It was the form, it was the power of words, the power of language, that in a way was attracting him as much as the language of painting was always being dissected by him. He read all the modern novels, Balzac, Flaubert, Huysmans, Zola, of course, Maupassant, but tended to ignore the symbolists. He wasn't right up to date. There was a kind of Dutch matter-of-factness, if you like, in his reading, but wide and expansive and always wanted to exchange ideas, and very much regretted those artists who didn't read. He couldn't understand why they wouldn't allow themselves to be influenced by what they read and see the connections between what they were doing as painters and what they could find in literature of their time.
That's an interesting point of view because he fits the stereotype of the typically mad artist. But of course, that isn't true. The portrait you're drawing really is an artist, a painter, who is an intellectual.
But an intellectual in his own terms. I mean, I think there's a very something an autodidact about Van Gogh, which we mustn't forget. I mean, after all, he virtually taught himself to draw and paint. He went through many of the manuals to learn about proportion and perspective, almost like a schoolboy doing it very slowly through the long hours of the night. And in a way, his reading of literature has that element. But yet his responses are so warm and his judgments are so incisive that I'm not using autodidact in a pejorative sense. I mean, this is a fact, but it's not a disability. It's a great plus in his sense.
It was in Brabant, when he was still wrestling with his religious aspirations, that he decided to become a painter, only 10 years before his death. But in his first drawings of the world around him, and in his first attempts at self-portraiture, his art was deeply personal, humanitarian, and intended to reflect the dignity of labor. Now he could pour out his feelings. To Theo, he wrote that painting peasant life is a serious thing, and he wanted to make drawings that would arouse serious thoughts. To draw a peasant's figure in action, he said, that was the very core of modern art. Working among the people of Brabant, he saw himself as a peasant painter, struggling with them, eating in their soup kitchens. It was here he fell in love with a prostitute called Sienne Hornick. For a time, he thought of marrying her. She had an illegitimate daughter and was pregnant when he met her. They lived together for more than a year, the longest relationship with a woman in his life, and she was the model for one of his most affecting lithographs. His family was shocked by his way of life, But the bourgeois world did not interest him. The weaver and the peasants were now the focus of his art. Not sentimental melancholy, he said, but serious sorrow. He wanted to do work that would touch some people. By now, he had renounced the church in a bitter quarrel with his parents. What am I in most people's eyes? A nonentity or an eccentric and disagreeable man? Somebody who has no position in society and never will have. In short, the lowest of the low. But, he wrote to Theo, I want my work to show what is in the heart of such an eccentric, of such a nobody. This is my ambition, which is, in spite of everything, founded less on anger than on love. He began a whole series of studies of one peasant family living in the neighborhood of his father's church. He did not hide their coarse features, he did not sanitize their surroundings, but showed their lives in all their grimness. These people eating their potatoes under the lamp and putting their hands in the plate have also tilled the soil, he wrote to Theo. So my picture praises both manual labor and the food they themselves have so honestly earned. It was his first masterpiece, and it marked the midpoint of his 10 years as a painter. Nowhere is there a greater collection of his work than at the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam. And here you can see the many influences on his vision, from his dark Dutch palette to the work of his contemporaries in Paris, Pissarro, Signac, and Gauguin. There was another major and perhaps surprising influence, the work of Japanese printmakers, much in vogue at that time among the progressive painters of Paris. There were other influences, too, such as the great French painter Delacroix, and Van Gogh also admired Monet, Millet, and Monticelli. But the greatest influence was yet to come. He arrived in the spring of 1888 and found a landscape he could not believe. He wrote a letter to Theo immediately. I think this country is as beautiful as Japan in the limpidity of its atmosphere and the brilliance of its color. He had not seen Japan, and he had not left France, but had taken the train south from Paris and found Provence and its ancient towns of Arles and Saint-Rémy. Provence are French, of course, but they have a distinctive character formed throughout centuries of history. In medieval times, this was a kingdom with its own traditions. This was the society to which Van Gogh had come, so different from his own in the south of Holland. To him, Japan was a synonym for color, and as he wrote to Theo, the towns of Provence seemed to emerge from a Japanese dream. This place, Provence, was to be the proving ground for Vincent van Gogh and all his passionate ideas. If he had not come to Provence, the history of art would have changed. But Van Gogh did come, and here all his talents burst through. What I learned in Paris is leaving me, he wrote to Theo. I am returning to the ideas I had in the country, before I knew the Impressionists.
And then the impact of this place on him, the difference of the light between Northern Europe and Southern Europe. There is such a difference in terms of climate, in terms of light, that for any painter it would be stunning, but for Van Gogh it was remarkable.
As you say, I think for any Northerner coming here for the first time, it's a terrific shock. It's not just the light, it's also the vegetation, where you see olive trees and cypresses and pine trees in quite that mix as you find here in Provence. And that certainly, I think, was a great shock for him. And it's curious how after a time he will hone in on those three trees in particular, became very great symbols for him. But the light, yes, and the color that went with it. But then one often feels he saw this through Japanese and Delacroix and Monticelli. It wasn't just himself seeing, he had this kind of lens through which he would project the colors. And he carried a lot of artistic theory with him as well. He wasn't just a natural painter or a kind of naive painter. He was a very sophisticated painter.
How many paintings did he do and how many drawings?
Well, in 15 months in Arles, for example, he did about 200 paintings and not far off 200 drawings, and also wrote about 200 letters. In Saint-Rémy, because of the periods of illness, the production was less, but nonetheless in a year in Saint-Rémy he must have produced 150 paintings. Fewer drawings and fewer letters, so that gives you in total, what, 350 paintings in 2.5 years? 350 drawings, 300 letters. It's not a bad output.
It's amazing. And he was ill as well.
Ill some of the time, certainly, but I think there's always a distinction. Again, when you say, was he mad? I tend to retreat from this because, again, he's so conscious of his illness, which generally now is thought to be some form of epilepsy. That in modern times, modern medicine could be cured and at least controlled. That he's very conscious of the difference between those paintings that he's doing when he is well, and in between the illnesses, he was very clear and knew exactly what he was doing. And in the summer of '88 in Arles, when he was doing the wheat fields, he talks of the high yellow note I was striving for. And the whole hue and intensity of his palette just rises like that, and you get that marvelous series of symphonies in yellow, if you like, that he produced that summer.
In that summer of furious work, painting pictures now so familiar, Van Gogh wrote, "Is it not emotion, the sincerity of one's feeling for nature, that drives us?" Shortly after arriving in Arles in the spring of 1888, Van Gogh rented a house near the railway station. Its address was number 2, Place Lamartine, which for the next several months was to become his home, his studio, and sometimes his refuge. Not everyone liked the artist, but some neighbors agreed to pose for him, including the mailman. "Such a good soul," said Vincent. Nearby in Place Lamartine was a park where he painted. Van Gogh decided his new abode was the perfect place for an artist colony. It became an obsession, and eventually he persuaded one of his fellow post-impressionists to join him, the cynical and somewhat indifferent Paul Gauguin. In the dance halls and brothels of the town, they were two men together, but they were also men so dissimilar in temperament that it was only a matter of time before the crisis. Many years later, after the death of Van Gogh, Gauguin recalled their days painting together. Once, he painted Vincent painting his sunflowers. Vincent then looked at this painting and said, "It's me all right, but it's me gone mad." According to Gauguin, it was Gauguin's decision to leave Arles that caused the crisis. Van Gogh sliced off part of his ear and then went to a brothel they both knew, where he handed it over to one of the prostitutes. The news was sensational. Soon there was a petition to lock up the mad artist.
There's no evidence that he physically attacked other neighbors in the Place Lamartine. But the petition was that he was, A, a drunk, and B, would go around feeding young girls, and even married ladies. So this was the point of the petition.
And with the petition, Van Gogh was twice confined in the local hospital, first to treat his self-inflicted wound, then to treat the outrage of the citizens of Arles. To demonstrate his sanity, he made a portrait of the medical director, Dr. Ray. The doctor was not sure it was a good likeness, but his own self-portrait showed he had come through the crisis. He wanted to show his family he was in control and well cared for.
He was well cared for, except when the petition was made by 30 inhabitants of the Place Lamartine where he lived, saying he was not fit to be allowed to roam around and ought to be confined, and was confined in a single room without any books, any papers, any pipe, any tobacco for a month. And that was in March, April of '89. That must have been probably the most miserable month of his life, I would have thought. And in late April, he began to paint again. And that's when he painted the courtyard here.
The hospital had been here for 3 centuries when Van Gogh was a patient. Now it's been closed to become an artist colony, just as he imagined.
Perhaps of all the places in Arles, this looks as much like Van Gogh painting as anything, because literally this has been recreated from the Van Gogh painting, which I find ironic considering the pain that he went through in this hospital. At the same time, a certain degree of poetic justice that his painting, as it were, now one can walk into literally here in this courtyard.
He painted his bedroom, he said, to suggest sleep or repose, and now he needed both to recover from his mental breakdown. His self-portrait was lucid, objective, and calm. Yet the vision of Van Gogh could still encompass the universe in his nocturnal, almost supernatural pictures of tormented stars. As well, he could see the troubled passions of humanity. In the cafe where every night he would drug himself with absinthe, a highly potent drink, he saw a place where one can ruin oneself, go mad, or commit a crime.
He led a very hard life. He deprived himself of even the necessities of life a great deal, and he drank to excess, and it's also conceivable he had syphilis, that he drank too much absinthe, and given all that,
Given the fact that he would often work 12 hours a day in the meaty sun and eat nothing and then go home and drink an absinthe or something like that, he didn't give his body much chance. So given the fact there might have been an epileptic condition which was inherited, given the fact that he drove himself very hard, given the fact that he also indulged himself in the liquor, I think those three factors account for a great deal for the illnesses. And nonetheless, that said, and I don't have any specific diagnosis myself, only to say that I don't think it was madness, and I don't think it materially affected his painting or his drawing, or indeed the way he discussed literature.
Mad, perhaps not, but Van Gogh wanted help and came to this private asylum about 20 kilometers away in Saint-Rémy-de-Provence. It is still a private hospital. Ronald Pickvance arranged a visit to the asylum garden. Van Gogh wrote about this period in his life. Temporarily, I wish to remain shut up, as much for my own peace of mind as for other people's.
So in this disheveled, rather unkempt garden, he found almost a symbol in the ivy invading the pines, which became the subject of drawings and painting. He found his irises, his lilac tree, and many other such scenes in this particular enclosed area.
During his time in the garden, he was being watched over by the asylum director, Dr. Perron, who had to decide whether his artist patient should be allowed outside. How long was he actually confined to this garden, to this walled space?
Roughly 1 month after his arrival. He arrived on the 8th of May, and still in early June he's here.
Was he annoyed or upset by the fact that he was confined like that?
Maybe initially, because one of his points in coming here was that he should be allowed to draw and paint outside the walls. But I think the doctor was, from his point of view, medically perfectly correct in saying, look, let's see how you go for a month and just continue to draw and paint and use gouache as well as pencil and brush in the garden.
Even in these peaceful surroundings, he remained profoundly disturbed. During one breakdown, he ate his paints, but recovered and continued working with the same intensity, though he did not leave his room for 2 months. In the meantime, he was also writing long letters to Theo, who was still supporting his brother with money and materials. Visible from his window, he said, there was a reaper in the field below, who was for him an image of death. But there's nothing sad in this death. It goes its way in broad daylight, with the sun flooding everything with a light of pure gold. I find it queer that I saw it like this from between the iron bars of a cell. Just beyond the walls of the asylum lies the old Roman road. Julius Caesar came here, and so eventually did Van Gogh, but you wouldn't know it from his work. Did Van Gogh ever mention these antiquities? Was he interested in them? Was he impressed by them? They're extraordinary.
They are extraordinary and a strong tourist attraction for three centuries and more. But for him, no, he never mentioned them. As far as we know, he certainly never drew them, and rather he turned his back upon them and looked at nature in the guise of the Alpi as you see them here now. And walk up here and take his sighting from the Mont Gaussier that you see here, shaped like a lion, with the little rock with the 2 holes in it, Les Deux Trous and Mont Gaussier, which he attacked twice. And this for him was the point of this landscape, not man's distant past, but the landscape's essential presence. And very present it was. Although people see a lot of his tortured soul in this landscape, one has only to look at the landscape and those hills and the shapes and the tortured shapes to see how in itself that landscape was tortured. And this is what he captured, certainly, in two marvelous landscape paintings.
It used to be a monastery, the asylum. And here, in 1 year, in a burst of unparalleled creativity, Van Gogh completed 150 paintings and the last self-portraits.
And then the final self-portrait of his working life was this small one, where you see he's unshaven. And he looks a little more virile and, shall we say, peasant-like, which is what he wanted to convey to his mother, to console her that he was well, and to show her that he was still a man from Holland, from Brabant, who had known the peasants of Brabant and was wanting to be a peasant himself. And this is certainly, in my view, his last self-portrait, what I call his autumnal self-portrait. Look at these autumnal colors, as it were, which he's transposed into this image of himself.
That spring, 100 years ago, when Van Gogh arrived in the little town of Auvers on the River Oise, it was only a village, dominated by its ancient church of Notre Dame.
Why did Van Gogh come here?
He came here to return north from the south, where in many ways he was an outsider, he was a northerner, he was a Dutchman, he was an artist. And coming here, he felt he would rediscover the north, and by that he meant something that might even relate to Holland. He found it the true country, la vraie campagne. He loved the village, he loved the picturesque thatch roofs, he loved the river, he loved the whole feel of the place, and it's interesting also that he should paint the church. Having lost his faith several years previously, he had tended to ignore churches, and suddenly, in his work, the east end view of the church, with a Dutch-like peasant walking towards it as if it was the finale of his northern experiences.
He wrote enthusiastically about the village and a new friend, Dr. Gogh. He planned a portrait of the doctor who practiced homeopathic medicine and was, in Van Gogh's view, somewhat eccentric. In a letter to Gauguin, he said he had painted Dr. Gogh with the heartbroken expression of our time. The doctor was the friend of many artists, including Cézanne, Monet, Renoir, and Pissarro. It was Pissarro who urged Van Gogh to try working in Auvers. The doctor's daughter, Marguerite Gogh, also posed for him as he continued to paint furiously. There were drawings and watercolors by the score. There was an etching, and in the same 2 months, 70 great paintings, mostly portraits and landscapes. There are many bourgeois homes in Auvers, radiant and sunny and covered with flowers, he wrote to Theo. There is much well-being in the air.
And on the whole in Auvers, I think in many ways it could be called the happiest time of his life, in that he felt that he had a doctor who was not over-solicitous, allowed him just to say, well, go and work, and that's the final and the best answer to your problems, which of course he did, almost a picture a day. And he loved the place. He felt it was the real countryside. He produced many marvelous landscapes here. I don't think there was a decline in his talent. There's a genuine late style, as it were, coming through here, where all the experiences of his theoretical approaches to art and the practical questions and the influences seem to me to come together here in Auvers.
Why, after these 2 happy months, would he have gone out into that field and committed suicide?
One of the mysteries. Many theories. We don't even know where he got the gun from. We don't even know precisely where it all took place. All that we know is it suddenly happened on a Sunday afternoon with no real premonitions, and Theo felt he would recover, as he'd recovered from the air business in Arles.
How long did it actually take for him to die?
Late Sunday afternoon is the general time when he made the attempt in the open fields, staggered back to his room in the small, modest inn where he lived in the place opposite the mairie. Landlord was alerted eventually to his condition. Dr. Gogh was sent for Sunday evening, 9 o'clock, sends a letter to Theo, taken by painter friend Monday morning. Theo comes Monday morning, spends the rest of the day with him. He smokes his pipe, they talk, but unfortunately 1:30 a.m. on Tuesday, he is dead. In other words, it's almost 2 days.
But he could have lived if he had been operated on, do you think?
Today there'd have been no problem. But Dr. Gogh was an homeopath and did not believe in this, and the village doctor also felt it was difficult. It was the way the bullet had lodged that seemed to dissuade them from doing this. It's all again somewhat disconcertingly melancholic, this end.
Dr. Gogh and artists and friends from Paris came to bury him in what was then a new cemetery near the church at Auvers. One artist, Emile Bernard, recalled there was a wide blue sky and the fields around Auvers were ready for reaping. He remembered the sobbing of Theo van Gogh, who died, shattered by stress and grief only 6 months later. He left a young wife, Joanna, and a 1-year-old baby whose name was Vincent. More than 20 years later, Theo's widow transferred the remains from Holland to Auvers, where they were placed beside the grave of Vincent, his beloved brother.
It's curious, though, when you think of artists who died at 37. You can go back to Raphael, you can go to Caravaggio, you can go to Watteau, and then you can go to Van Gogh and Lautrec. And Modigliani was more or less 37, I seem to remember, maybe 36. It's a curious range through European painting. None of the others, well, Caravaggio had a mysterious death. Raphael had a natural death. Watteau had TB. Lautrec indulged in certain things. Modigliani also greatly indulged. I mean, the whole idea of the accursed artist, to which Vincent is also attached. I find it difficult to find a single answer. I find it difficult to account for this in any simple way.
What about the incredible popularity of Van Gogh now and the astronomical prices being paid for some of the paintings? What's the meaning behind that, if there is any?
I don't know. I simply don't know. It's what they call market forces, I suppose, and a new type of collector. On the other hand, in the 20th century, I think Van Goghs have always been relatively expensive. In that sense, it's not a new phenomenon. What is new is the catapulting of the prices 20-fold from what they were 10 years ago. But he always commanded reasonable prices compared with his fellow post-impressionists. And certainly, I don't think Gauguin will be pleased with the way things are going.
Is he flipping around in his grave?
I think he might be a little purgatorial about all this. But to account for this, it's another scene. It's another atmosphere, if you like. And
does it have anything to do with how wonderful the painting is, or how wonderful the artistic impulse was? Has it anything to do with that?
There may be.
People are betting on him as a horse, basically. This is the great painter, and he's...
Yes. Yeah.
You know, it's almost, well, it's almost disgusting, really, when one thinks about it.
Reminds one of what Gogh in his old age said. About 5 years before his death, he went to a sale, and one of his pastels brought an enormous price. And he said, I feel like a Derby winner who was given the hay after he's won. And maybe Vincent would feel something like that, too.
Art historian Ronald Pickvance. The great exhibitions on Van Gogh continue through this summer in Amsterdam and Otterlo in Holland. And if you want to know some more about Van Gogh, you'll be very moved by his letters to his brother Theo, which are available in paperback. We'll be back in a moment.
Unknown literature disappeared. Now, it's like a detective story.
In 1960, I did not think that Gulag Archipelago should be published. Why? Because it was a whole encyclopedia of the Gulag. I was frightened.
Please join me for the exciting revelation of what happened when Glasnost unlocked the Soviet vaults. Good night.
Al Waxman reprises his role as Judge Caldwell, this time on the opposite side of the bench, facing a murder charge and relying on Carey to defend him. Street Legal, Friday. From the Montreal Jazz Festival, highlights of the 1989 musical gathering featuring Oscar Peterson, Sunday.